Our story begins with a power, mass dark gathering to end the world on the. Even apologized to everyone for being too weak and reflected that Chris, our protagonist, should have been the hero in his place. The heroine begged even not to say those things, reminding them all that they did the best they could. Although I was frustrated, because that was all they had achieved. Then commented that if Chris the genie, I would have learned to learn fencing a little earlier. Could have exceeded the level, start and to have become a 10-star performer. If that had happened Chris, and Ethan, might have been able to stop the end of the world. The Big Extra was the nickname given to Chris because of his incredible talent, which allowed him to master anything instantly, which allowed him to leave behind a great legacy of achievement. The journey of this great extra. It began one day when I was in my 20s when Chris escaped from his clan, cursed and dreamed of success while working in alleys there. Noticed a mission on the board, a friendship for the Demon King of Carnage. Labeled as the mission of the Age of Destruction. Was recruiting a group to travel with the registered knowing that it was an opportunity unique in life and soar to achieve greatness so that when the war ended, could enjoy wealth and honor to his liking. Unfortunately, failed in the end. The domain of light finally fell into the hands of the Demon King of Carnage. When he heard the boy Van, wishing to be able to go back in time, to be selected as host, Chris thought to himself that even if he could return, I did not intend to repeat everything again. A life of suffering was enough, and there was no point in dreaming about it. Not now that the world was on the verge of collapse. The dark magic power was almost complete, and everyone could see that it was about to explode. Chris realized that it was truly the end. And in his last thoughts, wished that in his next life, if such a thing existed, was born the son of a wealthy family, closed his eyes accepting the fate of all mankind. But when he opened them, realized that he had gone backwards in time, was now in the body of a young man, master of the empire. Chris was in the dark magic clan, one of the 12 clans that supported the empire. So he could have deduced that gone back 15 years in the past, returning 5 years before the beginning of the era of destruction. I thought he had seen it all in his previous life, but never expected to witness demonic beasts, caring for a guard, and soon discovered in which body he had retrograde, in one called Christian Male Mary. Recalled asking a friend if Christian was a demon from a secondary family, and his friend confirmed that yes. She explained that the Count's house, hunting was a branch of the County of Males or Dark Magic clan. Chris asked if it was a relatively weak clan, but she thought not that even if it was a family. Secondary, had a good position within the Dark Magic clan. And not to mention the rich people who were. I doubted that there was only one demon in the empire. I thought I didn't know them. His friend added that he had heard that they had 2 potential successors. But of the eldest son Christian, it was known that he was a true despicable, an eternal troublemaker. The Count Khazar had finally given up on him. But all this was old news. Chris. Why it was considered old news, and if Christian had straightened out, and his friend talked to Christian, had been killed by his own relatives, and covered himself with cold sweat as he remembered this. He hit his hand against suicide with frustration. All I wanted was to be born into a family, rich and common, but instead I had gone back to that life. Exclaimed, bereaved. Why here? Why Christian? Why the despicable one who was destined to die? I didn't know what to do and forced his brain to find a solution. Then he realized that I had awakened in this body, one with a name coincidentally similar to yours, only 3 days ago, and that Christian would die in 2 years. The fact that Christian would have been eliminated inside the Count's house, hunting down a family that highly valued honor, probably meant that Christian was good for nothing. Therefore Chris thought that if he simply kept quiet and well behaved, could avoid that fate. Then he thought that since he had woken up as a rich child, should simply take care of himself and enjoy wealth and honor. But then he slapped his forehead, realizing that such a life, it was not going to be possible to Ragnarok, the end of the world, and the reason why the Demon King of Carnage, the war had begun, was to offer to humanity as a sacrifice to complete it. Recalled that by the time they discovered this, it was too late. Both the domain of light as the empire had found their last undoing. That meant that if I wanted to paint, needed to stop the apocalypse, knew that the king, demon of carnage, was the one who had started the war. But the biggest problem were the innumerable demons in the Greek Empire that were loyal to stop everything. Chris thought he had to become someone even more powerful than the Demon King of Carnage. I knew there was only one way to do it, needed to become the demon emperor and achieve the pinnacle of the empire, realized that he had been given 5 years before the start of the was of destruction, and decided to give it a try. If it was successful, that mansion and the entire empire would be his. A moment later the Count Hunt hit the table with anger and shouted that he was, "I am sure I have ordered you to stay in your room." Then asked him if he was not ashamed to show his face. Thereafter, causing that incident it had not been long before, warned him that if he behaved badly once again, he himself would cut off his head. Chris remained silent, realizing that the Count Hunting had an incredibly intimidating aura. But then the Count Hunter was surprised when Chris calmly explained that he had come to himself for all the mistakes they had made so far. Chris knew that if he wanted to move forward with his plan, should get rid of the image of the one who Christian had built. Count Chaser asked him what he had just said, and Chris thought he was really sorry for everything he had done, and promised it would never happen again. However, the Count Hunt asked him if he expected him to believe such words just a few days after his last disappearance, and if he thought he was going to make fun of him. He looked the other way, wondering what the last mess would have been Christian had gotten himself into before his regression. "I'd heard so many stories that I couldn't even invent one yet." Admitted that part of the reason why Count had lost faith in him it was his fault. Explained that 3 days ago had lost a part of his memories, and in trying to recover them, reflected on his actions, and realized how wrong she had been. His life was once again heartily proclaimed. However, Count Khazar was not willing to give in and reminded him that he had already heard excuses like those countless times. Chris agreed that the words alone meant nothing, and she assured him Hunting Hawk that would demonstrate its was worth through his actions henceforth. Then begged Hunting Hawk to send him to the punishment cave and swore stay there for a month, determined to show him a different side of himself. The punishment cave, a prison used for high-status demons, was a place lack of light, where all 5 human senses were blocked. Even a few days inside were enough to exhaust a person's mind. However, it was the perfect place for Chris at the time, as I needed a place to escape the attention of others. The Hunting Count asked him if he really wanted to be confined to the punishment cave for a whole month, adding that he doubted that Chris could last even noon. But Chris spoke with confidence, stating that he was completely aware of how difficult that place was. He still believed, which was the minimum necessary to gain the confidence of the Count Hunting. Count Chazar looked at him in silence for a moment, before asking him if he realized how many times they had already had that conversation. Reminded him that each time he just finished. Disappointed, this left Chris speechless. Fortunately for him, Count Hunter accepted and said he would let him try, giving him one last chance, but warned him that if nothing changed, after a full month, would expel him from the clan. Chris clenched his fist tightly, knowing that this would amount to a death sentence. He had countless people who would see Christian's life once he lost the protection of the clan. Even so, I thought he understood, and then asked the Count KSRC to prove that he had changed, would grant you a request. This infuriated the Count Hunt down, who told him he sounded in front of him, as if he was sure that he would be unharmed. But he accepted, swearing that if Chris could prove that had changed, would grant you any request. The Hunting Count then walked away, correcting it with a cold observation, saying that it did not mean that, thought it would ever happen. A moment later, Chris was in her room, staring something on the table when Fox, the butler of the house Hunting, and a half-vampire, entered to inform him that the punishment cave had been prepared. Chris placed the object on the table, and I thought he understood, followed Cock down the hallway as the servants whispered to each other that the boy had volunteered to enter the punishment cave. Speculated about what kind of trick Chris would be plotting this time. Heard mention of the recent incident in which he had insulted the young woman, poisonous magic clan lady. An incident whereby the Count Khazar had to himself personally whispered that it had been humiliating, save appearances against a rival clan, and wondered when he had known would finally mature. Some even started betting how long he would last in the punishment cave. When Chris heard that the highest bet was 2 days, smiled with sufficiency and continued to walk in silence, without knowing that someone was watching him. Finally reached the punishment cave. 2 huge fish guards were stationed at the entrance. Chris looked at them and thought that using death shields as guards was quite suitable for the Empire. Began walking towards the cave door, without worrying about the guards, as long as they could prevent other people from will enter the cave. But suddenly someone shouted, "Brother!" The older man turned around confused and saw a familiar face. Then realized that he was the brother, Christian Biological, the model student, for Baron Kazotor. Then unsheathed his sword and pointed it to him. What surprised Chris. Although it moves quietly, and simply looked him in the eye. This terrified Ator, but I could not calmly prove it. Chris asked him what he wanted from him. As he did not seem to be there to say goodbye, Archer told him that he knew perfectly well that Chris was a disgrace to the family. And although I didn't know what kind of problems was planning, now warned him that if again tarnished the honor of the family, would personally kill him. Tor then asked if he understood, and informed him that this was his last warning, which made Chris realize that it was probably Ator who caused the death of Christian. Recalled meeting Ator personally during the era of destruction, when Tor was a demon famous for his magic. Chris sighed, thinking that Tor, it had been nice as a child and had trained diligently. But now I was just a brat in front of someone like him. Someone who had faced the horrors of the era of destruction. Chris calmly pushed the sword of Tor to one side and told him that the moving Tor was surprised by his reaction and asked him what he had just said, but Chris simply, I thought he understood the warning and ordered him to go on. Tor insisted that he was serious and began to warn him again, but Chris turned around and entered the punishment cave. Yes, Tor, stunned and speechless. Tor then babbled, raising his voice to ask what that attitude meant. Inside the punishment cave, Chris walked wilder and noticed that he could no longer see or hear anything. Only the sensation remained in his fingers. Assumed that this was intentional, so that the prisoners could still feel the objects they carry with them. Otherwise they could starve to death. I knew that a person, common, would be exhausted mentally quickly in a place like that. However, that was irrelevant to him. Had experienced worse. During his days as a treasure hunter, and the isolation of the five senses was exactly what he needed. Would allow him to look deeper into himself. Without its five senses, Chris could not fix his currently damaged body. Would take a long time and good luck. But with the skills, medical conditions he had undergone for, dominate as the divine physician, the art of compression, that is, that he had modified from the modification techniques, body that he learned in the, and metallic stones of various properties, was certainly possible. Took one of the magic stones with his fingers, thinking that I would not have been able to get such stones considering how expensive they were, but he assumed that he was one of the luxuries of being in an elite clan, had honored their hearts. Although he was known as a hero, that reminded him as in his previous life he and Ivan had struggled to get magic stones. Pulled out the magic stones, knowing that I had to start with the white magic stone that would purify the toxins. It was a boring process, but I understood that it was essential. Required me to clean, meticulously, any accumulation of toxins in your body using mana. White. However, the slightest mistake could cause pain. Burning all over his body, began to purge every toxin from within. And in a matter of seconds, was 100% purified, having completed the process without even getting hurt. For him it was bread and butter. On the other hand, in the office of Count the Count, Hunting asked Cox how Chris Cox was doing. I thought Chris had entered obediently in the punishment cave, but he was concerned that he might break so much that I couldn't even ask for help. That made the Count Kr wondered if it had been a mistake. Send Chris to the punishment cave. Recalled that Chris had such a promising future as a child, and I didn't know what had caused it to fall apart so much. Suddenly, wondered if its nature. Talented had done it in front of the Count. Hunting thought it was what the reason was. I would rather see Chris completely ruined or even dead before living a life miserable, but then he remembered the confident Chris dove to prove it by his actions. The Hunting Count denied with his head and remembered himself, have no expectations. Chris had cheated on them too many times before. Then replied to Pox if I had noticed anything unusual when Chris entered the cave. Pox was surprised by the question and hesitated to answer, which infuriated the Count. Hunt down the one who ordered him not to hide nothing, and that would inform every detail. Cox admitted that Chris had brought metal stones into the cave, including a dream stone, and an object that induces hallucinations. Told the Count, Hunting, that since they were unaware of the side effects, they should open the cave immediately and take out Chris. But Count Kazar clenched his fist firmly and spoke. Not if that is the case. Said we should let Chris die a month later. Count Kazar stood in front of the punishment cave, thinking Chris must have been torn apart by then. Suddenly the door of the cave was opened from the inside, and the Count, Hunting, was surprised to see Chris, completely well and clean. Chris and Lee told him. The Hunting Count, who had arrived and was waiting for him, came out of the cave and stopped in front of him, asking him if he would be surprised and reminding him of the Count hunt for his promise to return as a changed man. The Count hunting was filled with tears, seeing the confidence in Chris's eyes. An expression I haven't seen since Chris was a child. The Count Chesser admitted that Chris had successfully endured the punishment. Chris laughed and asked him if that was a compliment, but he, Count Hunting, told him not to believe too much about something so minor, and reminded him that they still did not trust him and sigh in response, saying that only meant that he would have to try harder, and thought silently that the Count Hunting was an old. Assumed that the Count hunted. I thought I had barely endured the cave, but it was not the case. Chris had been so busy training that he did not have a single moment to feel bored. First, optimized his body to master the art of fencing. Thanks to the mana stone, white every cell of his body was full of life. Also the dream stone had been a game changer. Cox had tried to stop him from carrying the narcotic stone from Manhwa, but with time, Chris was glad to have been. Hallucinations had reduced the time required for metamorphosis. Chris also created 2 cores, one of them being a spell of a light star. Proudly thought to himself that he was a fucking genius. Needless to say that Chris used its mirror core to hide its light core, knowing that demons would cause a great uproar if they ever found out about it. If things had ended there, it would have been great. But then a magic stone floated near him. When he saw that it was the dream stone, smiled with sarcasm and thought for himself that it had been a mistake to give it to him. Probably someone he had waited for him to get high on her and fall apart, but Chris decided to accept this challenge and was planning to use it as a springboard for its forward jump. Then told Count Khazar that he wanted to make an application, as he had fulfilled his promise on. Count Chesser ordered him to speak, and Chris asked for permission to use the training camp of the heroes of the Black Swamp. However, the Count Hunt, they firmly understand that someone like him, a hero, had no place there. He reminded Chris that they were one of the 3 orders of heroes who supported the Dark Magic clan, and that only the most elites could demonstrate their skills in that space. Chris explained that he was not asking to join the order. I would only borrow the training camp, because I believed that observing the purge of the Black Swamp monsters would be a positive influence on him. Count Hunting considered it for a moment and agreed to, but warned him not to behave shamefully in front of strangers. Chris thought he understood, and when the Count Hunter was about to walk away, Chris stopped him, saying there was something else he wanted to ask for. The next day, in this training camp of the Black Swamp, the heroes were gathered when they noticed the approach of Chris. Whispered to each other, wondering if he wasn't the fool, young teacher, and wondering why he was there. Listening to them, Chris realized that they were openly defaming the Count's son. Assumed it was because they were in the Magic Empire, where force carried more weight than status. There was another reason why Chris wanted to go there. Whether I could obtain the letter of recommendation, but to cutie Milan. Count Chesar would give him the key to the library. That library was the subject of his second application, as it contained all the dark magic grimoires of the hunting house. Lyrim, dark magic, and accessing that library was essential. Just one day before, had asked Count Khazar why he had placed a condition on the application. When Chris was still a member of the clan, Count Khazar reminded him, as I had tried selling advanced grimoire on the black market at a cheap price. Chris was speechless, and his dying what kind of life had lived his body before him. Confirmed for himself that Christian had really been a bass. In the present, Chris was walking through the training camp, fully aware his principal priority was to win the recognition of the sub-commander, but then shadows appeared on his way. Looking up, saw a group of strangers blocking its passage. Among them was Traitor. Told him it was not a place where a worm like him could walk casually. Although frustrated to see a tour again, Chris smiled with an idea in mind. Thought it might be a good opportunity. Then warned him to return. Approaching him as I told him that I'm sure Chris didn't want to throw life away that he had so narrowly saved in the cave of punishment. Chris sighed and took a tour. If we could really keep those words. When it had been his father who had allowed him to enter in the training camp. Tor was surprised to hear that, and I couldn't believe it. Suddenly someone approached from behind, saying that he respected the Count's decision, but that he was not very reliable. When Chris turned around, saw that it was the sub-commander Milan as well. Noticed that she was releasing an aura, dark of at least 4 stars in strength. What it did to him to assume that his intention was to scare him from the beginning, not knowing that he was already used to threats such as this. Respectfully greeted Milan, which surprised her. I couldn't believe I had withstood his dark energy. then told them that since the sub-commander was also intervening, there was no way to avoid it himself, would prove that it was qualified to use the training camp. Mila asked how they could do it. Perhaps fighting one of the demons present. And in case of winning, warned him that his joke had already gone too far. However, I thought calmly that I was not joking and letting him refrain from using dark energy, as he knew that because of his rampant lifestyle, its ability to handle dark energy was far from what could have been. So I would prefer an unarmed duel if possible. Milan knew that even for a duel, to allow the heir to prove injured would be problematic. I understand if you really said you had a chance in an unarmed fight. He thought they would have to see him, and asked him to choose his opponent. Then with a wiggle of his fingers, signaled to Tor and told Milan that Tor would be appropriate. Tor was furious and demanded to know how he dared to do that. Milan told Chris that it would be better to find a more suitable opponent, and asked him if he was aware of which Tor was a 2-star level demon, a level that no 13-year-old child could achieve without exceptional talent. It didn't matter if someone was 13 or 23 years old, would not even touch the surface of such power. But Chris was no ordinary despicable, and he knew it. Shook his head and smiled at everyone, saying that if he had to prove himself anyway, it made more sense to fight someone stronger. Added that we will have to fight against Tor would be the best. Then watching a Tor in a playful way, asked him what he thought, and if he was afraid of his brother. That infuriated even more at Tor, who accepted the duel moments later. The Greeks surrounded them and shouted at Tor to take the opportunity to destroy Chris. Said if he sent Chris back in one piece, everyone would receive special training that day. Chris ignored the comments, full of hatred that they threw at him, and invited him to Milan. How the winner would be decided if the fight should continue until one of the two surrendered. Milan did not think and considered it insolent for not even knowing its place, and reflected that it would be nice if I knocked him out of action by taking a leg or two with him. Then you said giving up was too boring. Would fight until one of the two of them was left with incapacitated. Chris fake surprise and playfully wins in turn. If he had listened to the rules, and what did you do now that everyone expected him to get a good beating? Furious Tor, you made him a fool, insolent, and swore to shut him up once and for all. But Chris suddenly hit him in the face so quickly that it stunned him. Chris then mocked him, asking what was wrong with him, and calmly informed him that the fight had already begun. Tor looked at him furiously and tried to strike him back, but Chris dodged it. I knew that this fight was practically cheating. He had not even reached a star, and had no chance against someone who drove dark energy. However, in a duel without weapons, Chris had fought in countless in his past life. Chris knew that by counting only the power that he had obtained of the Dominion of Light and what happened in the Cave of Punishment was already at 3-star level. The Argentines were surprised to witness the crash, stuttering among themselves about what they had just seen. Tor took his hands to the stomach from the pain and spat blood. Chris then went out of shape, mocking if she was crying and if she wanted him to, blowing on that wound, which infuriated Tor even more. Tor what trick Chris had used, and for him it was Tor. In that state it was refreshing, but I found calm and thought there was no trick at all. Only asked if it didn't mean that Tor was a little too weak. That comment led to Tor to the limit releasing its dark energy, and although he agreed with Chris, he was filled with fury. Chris ignored the explosion and playfully asked him what he had just said, since I could not hear it, or it had been too low for you. Stretched out his arm and jumped at high speed towards him, screaming that Chris would kill him, narrowly dodged his blow and commented in a manner mocks his speed. Then launched a shower of punches, but Chris dodged them all easily. Chris blocked one of the tower arms and dissipated the dark energy, which left a full-on Tor. Before I could react, Chris punched him cleanly in the chin, knocking him unconscious. Knew from experience that the struggle was based on instinct. Tor fell to the ground unconscious, while the Greeks were left with their mouths open. Surprised and incredulous, Chris slowly approached the Tor, while the shoulders whispered to each other, wondering if Tor would have trusted. Perhaps he had withdrawn his dark energy so as not to hurt Chris too much. For all of them, including Milan, made no sense. Unless Tor, Chris would have done it on purpose. Then he turned to Milan and asked him what happened, if that was enough to prove that he was qualified. She calmly replied that yes. He thanked her for recognizing it from the inside, was proud and excited that it had worked out. Outwardly he remained calm and serene, thinking for himself that from now on, I would devour everything, both fencing and magic. Days later, in your room, released its power of dark magic and saw that he had finally reached a star in dark magic, thought for himself, which had taken him longer than expected, since it was not yet fully handling dark energy. And there was a lot of residue left by Christian. Ringing the bell, while maintaining that it would have to further elevate its level to make it possible, manage the power of light simultaneously. A moment later, a ghost maid appeared. Was Merit, the servant assigned to Christian. I couldn't believe they were using a high-level evil spirit as a maid, but understood that it was probably due to the constant Christian's antics that they could not use another person. So Lee swore that he would definitely replace her later on, and ordered him to bring him some juice to drink before going to training. She asked him if he should prepare the juice with blood, but he ordered her to do it with strawberries without. However, she approached him and informed him that the blood juice, knew very well, was frightened but managed to insist that it was strawberry. Despite this, she tried to suggest blood juice again, pushing him to the limit, so he yelled at him to bring strawberry juice. A moment later, after drinking its strawberry juice, Fox arrived and asked him if he was going to train, even though it was still early. Hawk expressed his concern that Chris was forcing itself too much, but then corrected himself and said that in reality, was happy and proud of Chris' diligence, adding that he believed in him, even when others pointed it out. Chris, however, looked at him with released a wave of dark energy and left him angry. Who he thought to decide whether he believed in him or not, told Cox that he had never asked her to believe in him. Fox, surprised, made a deep reverence and apologized for having exceeded his limits. Then I wish you a good training session. Before leaving in a hurry. Even so, Chris was sure something was not right with Cox. Shortly after, Chris arrived at the training camp and noticed that the looks of the strangers were more docile than before, put his bag in and wondered if now with his guard low it would be possible to earn them little by little, then began to practice with his sword. One of the mechanics observed it for a moment before heading to a nearby store, the deputy commander's rest office. The suspect entered Milan's office and informed him that Chris had appeared again in the training camp. Milan moves what the hell was plotting and what had actually been. That duel recalled that the tour movements during the fight had been impressive. However, I still couldn't believe that Chris had tour dark energy at the perfect time. Began to wonder whether Chris could see through the flow of battle. If that were true, then perhaps Chris even had the talent to surpass Mr. Itchy Aaron, the direct heir of the main family. But then Milan's thoughts changed again. Reminded herself that Chris was still a despicable figure, that he had already lost much of his dark energy because of his lifestyle, unrestrained in his mind. It should have been impossible for him to close that gap now. Suddenly he heard a loud noise from outside and ran out of the store to ask what was going on. One of the engineers explained that apparently Chris had had a small conflict with a squire, and everyone was surprised to see what cannon a demon from a star had fallen to the ground. The revelation, rumors and suspicions that Chris could have reached a star on the same. I love Milan, equally astonished, standing with confidence, told them that he had wanted to witness the legendary Black Swamp monster's dexterity, but until now there were no living up to his chest. Then asked them if no one else was going to get up, or if it really were just an order of cowardly heroes. His words infuriated the Greeks. Just at that moment, a masked Susai took a step forward and showed up as Torin. Chris smiled by realizing that they had fallen into his trap and told them to come to him. Torin raised his wooden sword to attack him. Chris, I knew he would never be taught willingly to a despicable, discover the secret techniques of the heroes, so he had no choice but to steal them. Blocked Torin's attack and counterattacked, closely observing the grip, chest and fluid foot movement. Fit his grip on the wooden sword, identifying that play fencing that I had only heard of in rumors. Assumed that if he executed it approximately, it would work. Copied the technique and foot movement, then cut off his wooden sword towards the bull's face. The blow surprised Milan, and Chris even more, smiled proudly knowing that he had executed him perfectly. Minutes later, Torin had already defeated himself on the ground, and Chris sat on it. The reflections surrounding the scene panicked at the sight that he was really that strong, wondering if their iron core really had been destroyed, and how it had reached a star in the midst of all the chaos. Paralyzed Milan realized that he had made no mistake after all. Perez looked around and commented, coldly that the exhibition had been disappointing, added that he seemed to have trusted too much in the shoulders, and that if his abilities were so pathetic, then perhaps the deputy commander should assume some responsibility. Hearing that, Asians panicked, wondering if they should stop Chris and thinking he was crazy to provoke Milan. Milan, barely containing his anger, told him that he understood his emotion for an unexpected victory, but he asked if he wasn't playing Harry a little too much and stood up and ended up challenging her, suggesting that he show him the real Milan Black Swamp Monster's skills. Then he drew his sword from the shield beside him, surprising the Greeks, and sent a powerful cut in his direction. The ground cracked deeply by the furious force, called it despicable, and warned that he could take care of someone like him in a second. He answered calmly, if he prefers to fight someone like him, using all its power, and succeeded in limiting their dark energy to the level of a star and prohibited the use of dark magic, also suggested that they use wooden swords as weapons. She took the wooden one and pointed it at him, telling him I would break his legs, using only half the power of a star. He calmly asked him what he would put his legs on the line and you. She thought she didn't care about anything, because he wasn't going to walk out of there that day. Then he lunged at him, and swinged his sword strongly, fortunately, trying to block it. But she was much stronger than he and struggled to hold his own, then bombed it with attacks. But he managed to block every blow. The heroes, watching, they could not believe that I was holding on. Considering that he was facing his commander, they speculated, which was perhaps only due to the fact that the main weapon of the Elan was a big sword. Milan, on the other hand, I knew it wasn't the weapon for some reason. His attacks did not reach Chris. She reminded herself that Chris was a weak-footed man, that he should not be an opponent for her, but began to question if what was happening now was similar to what had happened when he fought against Tor. And even before that, Chris smiled at the sight of Milan's confusion and told him that it seemed that things did not go as she expected, which infuriated her even more. She told him to shut up, then squeezed his grip on the sword, then began to meet dark energy on his sword and sent a mighty cut in his direction. Breaking the ground, Chris immediately threw herself to one side, successfully dodging the blow, and then at high speed, harried towards her and hit her head in the face, leaving her surprised. She instinctively hugged her nose, even more surprised when she saw that he was bleeding. Chris was pleased that his plan had worked out. Milan was a magic sword, and as long as their dark magic was limited to lapse in its defense would leave it ability to recover only with physical strength, or at least that's what I had judged. Chris knew that if Milan was a purely sword-centered demon, Milan Rio might not have worked strongly, and admitted that he never imagined he would headbutt. Confessed that he had underestimated him too much and swore that from that moment on would be concentrated. He pointed to his neck and asked him if the fight had not already finished. She looked down and saw a slight scratch on him, explained that he had scratched with his fingernail during headbutt, and asked him what would have happened if his fingernail had been with iron. Accepting defeat, told him to mention his wish, but in return, asked him for the opportunity to fight him again. He thought that if that meant a tiebreaker, I would have to accept a second application to what she felt. Then approached her and in whispers asked him if he would kneel before him. She, surprised, whispered that he understood it was a condition impossible to complete with. His loyalty was with the family name of the dark magic clan, the male house. He whispered back that I knew who was only there on a family outing. Main, but we did. If that would not be solved, if he became the young lord of the clan. Surprised, asked him what he meant by young gentleman, calling it, and reminding him that the 5 young gentlemen of the whose inheritance rights had been recognized were all direct descendants of the main family. But he thought there were none. Rule the family member should be. Dad could not become a young gentleman. And in any case, accepted its double application. Then I understand Milan, if they could have their revenge in 1 month. Explaining that he also needed time to train. Added that next time they would set clear limits. She told him that if that were the case, would have no chance of defeating her. But he just answered who knows, and said that few things in this world were really impossible, leaving her speechless. Then made an elegant reverence and told him that they would see each other in a month internally. Swore that day I would make him see Milan, where his loyalty should really be later on. Presented the letter of recommendation for Milan Falcon de Chasseur, reported that the foundations of the devil lacked what was necessary, so they should put more emphasis on training. The letter was silently examined and recalled the report of the Milan where he mentioned that Chris was a genius despite his low star rank. That had easily defeated other solid knowledge. And that even she had been defeated by him on. Count Khazar asked Milan to confirm if she too had been defeated. She admitted it and told him it had been a weird fight. One that in fact had enjoyed the Count. Hunting looked at Chris and thought, maybe this time it has really changed. Chris felt disconcerted by the gaze of the Count Hunting and asked him if he had something on his face. The Hunting Count simply costs nothing. Then he handed over the key to the library as promised. After receiving it, Chris came out of the room and lifted the key proudly. Congratulating himself, had not only gained access to the library, but had also managed to change the mentality of Milan. Knew that Milan was a demon of the family of the Dark Magic clan, and that during the era of destruction, had been active as a 6-star demon. If he wanted to take control of the entire Dark Magic clan, he needed to make Milan one of his cuirassiers. Understood that he had not yet completely beaten Milan, but I was confident that 1 month would be sufficient. His Diane and I firmly believed he was a genius. While walking outside the office, thought of the Count Hunter's expression, and wondered if it had been a look of paternal pride. Maybe demons also had family attachments. Perhaps the Count Hunt would turn out to be a better father than the one Chris had in his past life. Upon entering the library, swore to his new father that he would not let him down. Immediately remained by the content of the library. There were books on blood magic, invocation studies, curse studies, and more. All prohibited topics in the domain of light. Took a book from the shelf and started taking it out. But then Maria appeared behind him and ended up surprising him so much that he stumbled and screamed, asking why he was there laughing. She asked him why else, and explained that once had been the librarian of that place, leaving it even more confused. Then Maria asked him if he could and went on, being the same old fool, which caused him revulsion. Immediately ordered him to shut up. But she didn't stop telling him her brother is better than him. This infuriated him even more, and he shouted again to shut up. But she just laughed. Mary then noticed that the grimoire she had chosen contained a 4-star dark magic spell called Linkage Seal, and told him that as he was, I would not be able to understand. He closed the booklet and told him he was fine because he was a genius. Mary was speechless for a few seconds, then acted proudly and declared that he was not only a genius, but also handsome. That irritated him, and he told him not to force him. Then I understand if there was any reason why he had chosen specifically that book. He thought so because he needed to catch a rat. The next day, I was in the training camp doing the race, morning along with the other jurors. While running, I thought about who the rat might be. The first prototype was a Tor. No one in the house despised him more for being a hero. The second was Cox, although Cox was not a descendant of the clan. Had free access to the punishment cave. Chris also knew that among the demons, power was more important than social status. However, Cox clung to him, constantly flattering him. I suspected that it might even be a third party, not yet aware of it anyway. Who was behind it all? Clearly wanted to see it in ruins. Especially after they put the stone of dreams in the cave of punishment. The race and considered whether it should behave like the despicable one they wanted to be. I knew that who else pleased to see his misbehavior was probably the culprit, so cursed out loud and shouted that it was too difficult. Then walked away, telling the boys to enjoy his career. The other boys were confused, wondering what happened to him later. On the dining table he threw a plate of food on the floor, which made that Count Hunter rises up furiously and shouts his name. Chris simply replied that the servant should have told him. Served adequate food from the beginning, then shouted to the servants, ordering them to make him the food again by the Count. Hunting looked at him, furious, and said he was a fool for thinking that he had finally matured. Then disappointed he rose from the table. Chris felt a little bad, but he remembered himself that it was for the good of the family. I was hoping that Count Khazar would eventually understand. In the following days, Chris wanted everyone to call him the devil. Hard to spread. Rumors that he had returned to being a despicable, walked the maids during the cleaning and spent money as if not was worthless, and tormented everyone around him. One day Mary poured juice in his wine glass, which infuriated him, and shouted at him, asking him why he wouldn't let him drink wine, laughing. She told him that she was drinking wine only without alcohol. That infuriated him even more, and shouted that she had taken the alcohol from him. Mary calmly explained that he was a minor, and I shouldn't be drinking in the first place. He replied why it mattered if he was already a despicable gentleman. Then she asked him if he really had decided to become a despicable again, and sweetly added that no matter how much he would always stay by his side. That made him sick, cast a spell, and reminded him that he had already told him that he was hunting a merry rat. Was surprised to see the dark magic, and asked him if he had already mastered the binding seal spell Yahello. I proudly thought he was a genius, and that it had modified it, so that it could be used even at a lower star level. Added that he had not been alone wasting his time, but had been working hard, mastering several spells. But suddenly, Churi broke up in her room, slamming the door just as Mary. I asked him if he was truly a genius. Chris immediately acted as if he was drunk, burping while asking Tor what was happening, and why was there Tor. Furiously demanded to know if he really. That was the best I could do. Screaming that I thought Chris had changed for the better. Chris smiled, realizing that loyalty Tor was genuine. Now I could eliminate Tor off its list of heroes. Quietly told Tor that he thought there was a rat in the house. Confused Tor asked him what Chris was talking about, explained that someone wanted to see it fall, and that he dies. Act as if you were participating in your plan. For a time Tor, I thought if I was saying that it had all been a performance, and Chris confirmed it with a feeling. Then pointed with his glass of wine to the Tor nose, and told him that even the wine was a fake. Tor smelled the cup and realized it was juice. Asked him who the rat was, but Chris thought it was still hard to say. For now they only had to wait for the bait to be taken. Then Chris threw, intentionally, the glass of wine on the floor. A servant quickly ran to the room, asking if there was a problem. Chris shouted that the wine was not what had happened, and ordered the servant to tell him. So the butler who brought him another bottle. The servant ended up nervous that Cox was busy at the time. Chris playing if Cox was busy. Then said he would go to visit him himself. Listened to his drunken performance. Tor was surprised at how convincing the performance was. Minutes later, Chris arrived at the Cox office and stamped the bottle of came upon the desk in front of him. Cox replied that he had taken him there, but Chris took the bottle again and spilled the liquid on the Cox's head, babbling. Chris accused him of belittling him, saying that the wine was not what he had asked for. Cox got up immediately, and he insisted that it was not belittling, and that he would send someone to look for the wine immediately. But Chris disagreed and ordered Cox to get it himself. Cox clenched his fists, frustrated, and told him he was in the middle of something. Chris came out mockingly, asking him if he prefers to continue working in that state, and reminding him that he should be changed, so he'd better hurry up by growling his teeth. Cox tried to calm down and accepted, walked away without knowing that Chris was watching him closely. In reality, Cox was struggling to contain his anger, thinking he should be praised for his patience, but without power to suppress the foam that accumulated inside once it. Cox left. Chris looked at the papers on the desk, examined them carefully, and smiled. I had a feeling that Cox could be the rat if he was like that. Would probably be involved in shady dealings related to finance. But I still did not have enough evidence. Needed more convincing evidence. Put the papers back in place just as Cox returned with the bottle of wine that Chris had requested. Chris thanked him and asked if he was upset with him. Cox immediately replied that no, saying she could never get mad at him. Laughing, Chris praised Cox and told him that even though he didn't know if he should say so, Cox was his favorite. Cox bowed and thought he was very grateful. Then Cox reported that he had a message for him. When Chris asked him what he was, Cox said that his friends wanted to meet him in secret in the usual place. That left Chris confused. I wasn't sure which friends he was referring to. Cox then pretended to be worried, saying that I would rather that Chris did not associate with them, although it was not their place to judge them. Seeing Cox's reaction, Chris thought he was going to meet them, and Cox accepted, acting as if they had no other choice. Chris smiled and sighed, thinking that things were going even better than I expected. The next day, in the secret place of meeting their so-called friends, expressed their emotion, saying that they had heard rumors that he had recently changed. But I didn't believe it for a second, for them had always been the best among them. Looked at the young maid serving him wine and got irritated, thinking to himself how much I thought it was those people to make such a young girl. We'll serve you drinks. The men lifted their wine glasses, and the man suggested that they drink. Chris lifted up his glass of wine and smelled the contents. The men asked him what he was doing, and urged him to drink at once. Instead of that, threw the wine in the wild man's face. The man panicked at the sight of the wine and asked him what he thought he was doing. Briss, quietly, that I knew they had altered sacred alcohol for their hearts. Yes, they knew perfectly that something had been put in it. Tried to explain, but he raised a finger and pressed it against the servant's forehead, releasing a little luminous magic, which made her fall into a deep sleep. Both men were surprised to see him use magic and was asked if he knew dark magic. Briss hit the ground with her foot, frustrated, saying that it was not the time to be surprised. Then them both by the hair and crash their faces against the table. Without stopping, continued to bang their heads against the table until he was begged to stop. The mystery man shouted, asking why he was doing that, and begged him to calm down. Briss smiled and pulled something out of his jacket, said that if after this they still did not understand what they had done wrong, could die on the spot. He later revealed a sharp knife. Moments later, the room was a mess with the two men tied with ropes. The thin man fearfully pleaded for mercy while Briss stuck his knife into the ground, dangerously close to him, making man wet himself with terror. Man, they then confessed that they had been ordered to drug Briss and to incriminate him after killing the girl. The unknown man added that the person who gave the order had blackmailed using his involvement in drug trafficking, illegal, leaving him with no option. Briss, who gave the order? The thin man looked away, hesitating to speak. Briss pushed the knife deeper into the ground, and also if they wanted me to cut off their hands. Screaming in panic, the thin man admitted that it was Cox. Both men prayed for their lives and promised do whatever Briss asked. Briss asked again if they were serious, and if they really swore it when they frantically nodded. Acted as if he had not heard them. What forced them to choose who swore to him smiled. Said he would take his word for good, and cast the spell of dark magic, seal of lake on them. Placing the seal on their heads, as they screamed in pain, the spell took effect and both men fell to the ground. The next day, Cox broke in Count's office, hunting in panic, shouting that there was a problem. Count Khazar asked him what had happened. Cox reported that Briss had committed murder. Count Khazar rose abruptly, surprised. Cox went on to say that it seemed that Briss had gotten drunk the night before, killed the girl who served him the drinks and threw his body away to the river. Added that this was not something that could be done easily, cover up and find out what they had to do. Chirping his teeth on, Count Khazar ordered that Briss be taken to the court of the Tense, and that he would invoke his authority for an immediate trial. As he walked away, did not realize of the little princess, satisfied that it formed on Cox's face later on. At the court of the Fiends, Count Khazar was standing on stage while Briss remained in the dock. When Count Khazar finished reading the charges, Briss confidently denied everything and declared that he was innocent. This response infuriated even more Hawk Hunting, who demanded to know how he dared to lie in the presence of witnesses. Briss calm asked how there could be witnesses when there was no, asked for nothing, and stated that there must have been some misunderstanding. Looking slyly at his two friends sitting nearby, then called the maid and asked if the Mexican servant they were talking about was the same girl, which shocked the two men. The girl confessed that Briss had taken her home after he regained consciousness and had given him money to help pay your rent. Then pointed to the two men and revealed to everyone that they were the real culprits. As they had drunk the drink of Chrysalis Sal, of the court was filled with confusion, while I was trying to understand what was happening. Before the two men could answer, Chris activated the seal of bond that he had placed in their minds, bringing the situation to a peak. The two men started to panic at the sight of the maid. But then his eyes went blank when the link seal was activated. Both, under their influence, confessed that they had given reports false under Cox's orders to incriminate Chris. Cox, now visibly panicking, accused the two men of talking. Turned to the Count Khazar and insisted that it was defamation, claiming that Chris and his friends were pressuring to incriminate him. Cox shouted that the joke had already gone too far. Chris imperturbable. He sighed as he expected Cox to react in that way. Then addressed the Count Hunting and asked him if he could make an application as a victim in the incident. Count Hunter thought it was Chris. Requested permission to act as proxy of the Count's hunting authority for interrogation directly to Cox. Count Khazar was speechless in response to the request, especially at the sight of Chris's confident appearance. After a pause, the Count Hunter agreed to grant authority and ordered that Cox to take the dog. Cox tried to argue, but the Count Hunting ignored him and warned Chris that if he was acting inappropriately, the authority would be revoked immediately. Pris agreed and assured him that he would finish quickly. Pris took the stage and formally declared that as a representative of the great ruler of the Greek Empire, His Majesty the Demon Emperor, as a member of the clan of Dark Magic which governs the eastern region of the South Asian Kingdom, and as representative of Count Khazar, would begin to question the defendant if turned to Cox and asked if he swore, respond to his words. Cox answered that yes. Pris playing again, this time invoking the authority of the Emperor. Demon and Cox raised his palm and swore again. At that time Chris activated the bond seal spell on Cox's head. Thank you all in surprise. Cox screamed in pain as the mark appeared on his forehead, the nobles present as witnesses. They could not believe that a simple child had cast a 4-star dark magic spell. What they did not know was that the seal of bond that Chris had used was modified to function, even in a lower star range. On one condition, the objective had to swear twice. Cox had fallen directly into Chris' trap. Cox screamed, demanding to know what Chris had done. Chris in response asked if there was no snow. Respond. And then questioned the reason why Cox had hired these two men to incriminate him. Well, Chris controlled the seal of bond within the mind of Cox. The pain intensified, forcing Cox to admit that someone he knew, his corruption, had threatened him. Cox added that this person had given him instructions to ruin Chris, for which he had tried to sabotage him since he was young, something the hunting count could hardly believe. Chris, if Cox was referring to the embezzlement he had been committing for some time, he reported that he had already admitted it. Then getting closer, Chris asked who had given him the order. Cox begged to stop, but Chris tightened control over the Cox bond seal, shouted again, and then stuttered the name of that. Chris did not release the spell, fighting even harder until Cox shouted the full name. The second son of the Asura dark magic clan. Chris then released the spell, and Cox by pain and fear tried to flee, knowing that I would probably kill him. Chris then pulled the sword out of his chest, and without hesitation, cut off the head of Cox in front of the whole court. The Count Hunting was stunned in disbelief. Chris, calm and serene, addressed the court and stated that under the authority of the Count had executed the judgment on the sinner Count. Then I understand why that was the decision he had made. And I understand that if they had left Cox alive, the family would have been left alive. Principal allegedly fabricated evidence and covered up the incident, while still kicking Cox's body. Added that they could not afford to be indulgent. Even more important, they intended to ensure that all those present remember the truth of what had happened. This surprised both Tor and Maelon, were watching from the side. Then reminded them that Sid had tried sabotage at what caused visible concern in the Count to hunt, opened a portal and ordered him to follow what Chris did without hesitation. Once they arrived elsewhere, Chris, where the Count was hunting, I thought it was a secret training camp, and explained that there were too many eyes in the court. Then Count Khazar asked him if he meant that Seth would cause more problems due to succession conflict. Price nodded in response. Count Khazar admitted that the power of that and the authority of a family are directly linked to the successor they support. And although Chris' decision could have been right, still seemed to him to be in a hurry. However, given the current situation, would have no choice but to support the first young woman, since the first young man, Morth, was a bloodthirsty lunatic. Chris told him there was another option. He himself would become the successor Count. Hunting was stunned and described the idea as crazy. Explained that someone from a family branch could be recognized as a successor if he owned the necessary skill. The Count Hunting reminded him that this was only a rule in name and was rarely applied. Chris thought he knew nothing about politics. But I understand, because the Count Hunting dies that thirst. The Count Hunter had tried to sabotage it too much. Chris may have been more talented than thirsty in his childhood, but now it was far behind. Chris, with confidence, said it would catch up quickly. And for that he needed the help of the hunting Count. Asked the Count Hunter to use his authority to recommend him to participate in the sacred rite, dark within 2 months. Count Khazar warned him that he must reach 2 stars to participate, and asked him if he understood that he had reached a star. Chris, without being discouraged, assured him that he would reach 2 stars in 2 months. When Count Khazar remained silent, Chris called him father and asked him once again for his help. Days later, at the start of the hunting, rumors spread quickly. On the complete transformation of Chris, it was said that the Count Khazar had been training him personally. Such a difficult training that even the most experienced mathematicians fought with him. Mientras tanto, in the secret training camp, Chris easily cut a huge fungus observing for themselves, saying that should tie it, using the clay sword technique and cutting it, using the black scythe sword technique. The Count Khazar was speechless when he heard this, since barely had learned to show him the black scythe sword that same day, but Chris had already understood it immediately. Another fungus appeared behind the Count hunting, and Chris asked him if he really had to approach it in the way in which they had been doing so. He questioned whether to maintain the technique so far apart was really efficient. What the hunting hawk left momentarily confused. Chris then jumped into the fungus, saying that he felt there should be a more effective method. Wielded his sword effortlessly, cutting the mushroom in a single movement. The Count Hun noticed that it was the clay sword, and asked him how Chris had managed to do that. Explained that the capsules of humanoid fungi were sufficiently resistant as to justify the clay sword, but that there were wrapped in black scythe sword energy. Count Khazar was deeply shocked from the inside by the impact of the knowing that a star one should not be able to achieve such a feat, however, and did a calm attitude and admitted that the combination was quite powerful. Sinbargo warned that using two techniques at the same time would make it difficult to use. Of course, Chris thought it was very easy. Then demonstrated a combined technique, using both the clay sword, like the black scythe sword, while Ed curse magic simultaneously. Commented that it was barely a mirror. At that moment the Count Khazar could no longer hide his astonishment. 15 days later, was lying in the training camp, exhausted, complaining that running was too difficult. It wasn't something I could do half-heartedly, especially because the resistance was crucial to increase your level of power. Someone then blocked the sunlight of his face and asked him if he was already exhausted. It was Malon. She reminded him that the duel was not so far away, and said he was looking forward to the promised date. He noticed that she always held that intense presence and sat down, him that he was doing the best he could to meet his expectations. Milan achieved its incredible growth, but noted that it was still a star one. She warned that if she did not succeed, meet their expectations, I would never get her to kneel before him. He got up and admitted that this might be true. But even then I thought I would learn something from grief, so it would not be in vain. Milan laughed and told him he was still full of energy, walked away, hoping that he would exceed her limits and entertain her. He knew she was currently one of the best 4 stars within a single level. There were 3 separate lower, middle, and upper levels. Chris, being a top star 1, was still far below Malon. However, Chris also knew that he came from a family rich, in other words, considered himself a wallet warrior. The next day, the husband gestured if he had finished packing his bag for departure. She proudly confirmed that yes, and then she took a walk showing her dress. Told him it was their first date together, so she had dressed to impress him. Was surprised hearing that, and shouted that she never said that I would go with him. Mary just laughed and acted shy, saying that he knew that he must have been worried that he was having a heat stroke. Added that it was a pleasure for her serve him. What only frustrated him the most, he asked him how in advance could suffer a heat stroke. Then recalled how I had asked the Count before, and if he could switch to a maid. Count Khazar had replied that he could not, because a master contract had already been established. Servant with C's explained that a high progress rank could not be managed without such a panic contract. Chris, the creator, if there was any way to cancel it on Count hunting site, and thought he would need share a deep kiss with Maria, and reminded him that he had been quite drunk on the day the contract was signed. Chris scratched his head in frustration, thinking that Count Khazar was of little help, and blaming Christian, as always, of being a hero back in the present. Told Mary that he could not go because he was on his way to a place full of people. Mary looked disappointed, and said he had been looking forward to the excursion. He tried to explain to her that his spiritual energy could harm others, but she began to cry and told her that she had been confined to the mansion for decades. Seeing his tears, he stayed, balking at the end. Leah accepted, let her go, but ordered her not to show herself to others. She threw foam into the air, thanked her, and praised him for being the best. He just turned around and told her to follow him. As they walked through the bazaar, Mary asked him where they were going. He thought they were on their way to a place where she could make a profit. Mary raised her message to show you a handful of coins and told him he already had enough money. He panicked and shouted that it wasn't much, then ordered him to return the gold. Mary, confused, asked if it was gold or ownership of land. He thought I was wrong. When she asked what it really was, explained that it was something they used to use before Then opened the cart door. Just to be when watching a tour. Already inside telling him it was late. Pris asked him what he was doing there, who was there to keep an eye on him in case he began to behave like a despicable. Again, Pris assured him that this would not happen, and said that he would simply, I was going to play Des. What surprised Tor. Explained that they were demons. And be close to alcohol, and the game was practically expected. Added that the game, even, was recommended by the Emperor, Demon, and that there was a reason why it was legal. In spite of this, Tur insisted that he would follow what confused Chris. Sat in front of Tur, and asked him if he was worried about his older brother. Tur was surprised by the question and stuttered, asking why he should be worried. He quickly shouted that he was only concerned that Chris disgraced the family. When the cart began to move, Chris told Tur that for someone like him, a little nerd, it would probably be too stimulating. The round so round, I didn't even know the rules, you came out abruptly. Saying that the game, it was just a card game and he swore he would crush that nose. Stop screaming. Chris, following the game, pretended to be afraid and said he was terrified. He really smiled warmly on the outside. But in his thoughts he called you a sweet summer child. Already confident that today's fool was a Tur. A moment later, arrived at a huge casing of Tur. Commented that he never imagined that a building could look like this, while Mary added that her heart was beginning to accelerate. Chris gave a tiger mask to Shuri and told him to stop acting like a peasant and put it on him. Entry required that their identities be hidden. Then ordered Mary that remained hidden, so that no one could see her, and leaned over to whisper something to her, which surprised her, laughing as Mary left. Said he would serve his order as long as Chris wore his black mask. Tur asked where Mary was going, but Chris simply told him that it wasn't something I should be, and suggested that they enter. The nobles and servants within the place paused and turned their attention to them. At the moment they entered, however, Chris and Tur quiet were seen by the nobles as born and raised as fools. Walking straight into the mouth of the wolf, Chris then turned to Shuri and replied to him if he wanted to make a bet on who could make the most money. In an hour offered that if he won, Chris would call him Big Brother for 1 month. Tur, if I meant it. And Chris confirmed it, but added that if Tur, I would have to call it beautiful. Honorable King Emperor Majesty Brother. Tur was confused, but Chris gave him a package of money and told him he did not have to accept the challenge if I was afraid. Enraged, Tur snatched money from his hands and asked who had said anything about being afraid. Then rushed to play with fiery determination, stating that he would go first. Chris sat at a card table. An old man by his side said that clearly would be his victory and commented that if he played a little more, I would probably gain a lot since it was quite good. Lisa acted excitedly and commented aloud that her luck was excellent that day. But I knew exactly how these scams were. At the beginning, the house let gain an amount modest to rookies to increase their confidence. And once the target became too confident, induced him to gamble big. Chris knew this routine well, soon heard Tur say it made no sense. I was sure I had a good card. Chris smiled with malice, thinking that Tur had already fallen into his trap in a mocking tone. Wins in turn why he didn't go home to sleep, which infuriated Tur. Tur continues abruptly, asking if Chris was also not losing money. Chris thought he had only lost 500 rupees. Tur then he shouted that he had lost about 1,000 rupees, which provoked whispers at nearby tables. Chris say, pleased to notice that the players around him had already marked Tur. Like a fool, I was sure a scammer would catch him soon. Asked him if he managed to continue playing, an angry Tur snatched more money from his hands and declared that he would continue to, when Tur turned around to continue playing. In a mocking tone reminded him that he had tried to stop him. But I really wanted it to Tur lose as much as possible, to become the perfect bait. A moment later, Tur was seriously sitting at the table, looking at his cards, without noticing the servant and the swindler around him, that were deceiving him in silence. Chris then saw the man next to Tur hit his knee with his hand. Exactly the sign I had been waiting for. At that time Maria appeared invisible to his side and informed him who had located the man he had mentioned. Chris praised her for her excellent work. While touring, in the end he lost his mind after losing 10,000 rupees. Minutes later, Chris arrived at the site objective with the help of, and ordered him to open the door, which he did. Upon entering, the demons inside were surprised and immediately blocked their way, demanding to know who he was and removed the mask, and asked them if they had not already recognized it. The realization came quickly, when they guessed he was the fucking young master, and then asked what business he had there. Chris ordered them to call his master shortly thereafter. Grantel, the leader of the Merchants Guild Grand, appeared with a curious expression, and asked him if Chris had come to visit him. Chris knew that Grantel had a reputation as a very talented traitor, but in reality he was a corrupt person. Chris told him that he had come to talk privately about Grantel. I thought what it was about, and Chris, I guess the people of Grantel, had cheated on his younger brother, someone he cared deeply for, and yet he had the deed to act like he knew nothing. Grantel was surprised, and ended up with a Tor. Was the man in the tiger mask. Chris confirmed it, and reminded him of which Tor was the murderer of Count Chazar. Grantel quickly tried to distance himself from the incident, claiming that he only managed the case and had no part in what others were doing. Chris asked him if he wanted to die at that moment. Mary was revealed in her true form as which completely terrified Grantel. Immediately fell to his knees and apologized, explaining that if they had known what Tor was the son of Count Chazar, I would never have allowed such a thing to happen. Grant him his gratitude for his mercy. Chris asked him if his words were not just empty promises to what. Grantel insisted that they were sincere, and that he would compensate them. When asked how much, Chris ended with 1 million rupees, which surprised Grantel. Grantel explained that they did not have that amount of money on hand. Chris then cost 200,000 rupees in his place. Grantel, knowing that this amount represented his entire fortune, asked if that would really be enough. Chris answered yes, but added that there was also something else he needed from them. Grantel, now I thought it was. A moment later, after purchasing Mary weapons, commented incredulously that he had used the 200,000 rupees he extorted to buy battle equipment. She proudly said that it had really been a great plan. Chris agreed with confidence. Mary then pointed to a sword that Grants had given him, recognizing it as Grenada's sword, which was once obtained by I guess he offered his soul. Mentioned that many demons had sought her out, as it was the weapon used after the fall of that castle. Although it was now rusty, Chris thought it was fine, that it was all part of the plan. Then told him to shut up and handed him something, asking him if he was right in assuming that she had continued to looking at it before. Mary saw that it was a necklace with a flower-shaped pendant. Chris explained that it was a gift for her, saying that he thought he could never leave behind their regrets without him. Said he was giving it to her so she could quickly achieve peace and move forward, and warned him not to misinterpret it. Mary admitted that both before and after her death, this was the first time they had received a gift like this. Thanked him with all my heart. Chris thought it was nothing, and told him that they should return home. She accepted, putting the necklace I had given him as they walked. Promised to put all his heart to return the favor, and said he would now make his blood juice even wilder than before. He was surprised and reminded her that he had told her no, I would drink any of it. Shouted that she was paying for her kindness with enmity. Mary then casually revealed that the blood was already mixed in strawberry juice. Who had been drinking all this time, disgusted. Asked if I was joking and told him to stop making comments. Horrible. Then stopped suddenly, feeling that he had forgotten something. Decided it was not important and chose to ignore the feeling, assuming it would come back to his mind later on. Not knowing what he had left behind in the case and trembling with rage with only a rupee in his name. The next day, early in the morning, Terry woke up in his room angry and recognized him. Chris woke up confused, just when someone took away his pillow from under the head. When sitting Chor, enraged, he demanded that he know why he had abandoned him, shouting that they had almost sold into debt because of him. It was then that he realized what he had forgotten. Tor shouted that he was lucky that someone had recognized him. Yawning, Chris apologized to Tor and guessed that Grantel had helped him. Then I take it, Tor, if I wasn't calling it incorrectly, and reminded him that he had lost the bet and needed to keep his promise. Told Tor to call him esteemed King Emperor, Brother Majesty, as they had agreed on what a Tor left. Momentarily speechless, Tor trembled with rage and tried to say it as best he could, while pulling out his snot, pretending not to hear it later. Tore his pillow in half and shouted the title at him. Esteemed King Emperor Majesty Brother. He pulled out his booger with a wink and said in a mocking tone to Tor, to ensure that he respected it, and to make an effort as well, to get it right. This infuriated and upset Tor, leaving him speechless. Tor responded angrily, shouting that one day he will be revenge, and warned him to prepare himself. Chris smiled, realizing that the adorable Tor, who would grow up trying to kill Christian. This was probably all because of Christian. Then remembered, asked, Langan's son, the interim leader of the Dark Magic clan, and the current young lord of rank 1, did not feel much towards Said, since he was not the real Christian. But I knew that if I wanted to become the young gentleman, I could not avoid a confrontation with him. I was planning to settle that brother's account soon yet. Thought that in order to do so, he would need to win Melon's support, then looked to his side and saw the bag of guns with grenade resting next to her. Dressed and approached grenade, knowing that at some point countless demons had tried to wield the sacred sword. The reason why now grenade was treated as a simple antique was because no one had been able to wield it. Decided to see how he would react, lifted her up by the chain that wrapped her, but released a surge of electricity, electrocuting his hand and forcing him to let go in surprise. Realized that he was rejecting dark energy, and thought that was to be expected, as it was an artifact made to channel power, sacred of light. But I thought that in the end he was still being just a weapon, and if I could analyze the mechanism that caused the discovery of dark energy, could use it, pulled a hammer out of the bag, and began to strike. Brunette emitted more electricity, and tried to resist. But he ignored the pain, and hit her again, just to break the hammer to pieces. Then brought out 2 more hammers of different types. He told the sword to submit now, because he lived, beat her all night. What made me grenade trembled with fear at his determination. A few days later, in the secret training camps, Count Khazar was standing next to Tor, and a lady asked him if his preparations were ready. Tor was in the affirmative. Then asked who the lady was with them. By taking a closer look, guessed that he had seen her somewhere before. When the lady turned to look at it, he immediately called her and greeted her. Respectfully, was the commander of the mysterious Black Shadows. Mario the commander responded with a greeting, commenting that it had been some time. Marion was the daughter of the elderly clan chief, the master of the Dark Magic clan, and the older sister of Counter and the Mink of Langan. As protector of the head of the elderly clan, was in charge of secret missions and surveillance, an elite among the elites of the Dark Magic clan. This made him wonder why such a significant figure had appeared there. The Count Hunting then explained that Marion had come for matters related to talks and that his visit was unofficial. Marion laughed and said he had committed a rather brazen action. Chris began to wonder if Marion was planning to protect Sked, which would be problematic. Told Marion that it looked like the head of the old clan I had a lot of free time if he dealt with such matters. She thought it was dared to assume that, since the head of the clan had no interest in the children's lawsuits, but seemed to be interested in him, which surprised him even so. Considered that this could be an opportunity to win the favor of the clan chief. But then Marion questioned whether it was bravery or reminding him that it had not yet reached 2-star status. And I was already challenging Milan, asked him to cancel the duel. Chris pressed grenade and thanked Marion for his concern, but said he had his own plans, all while unsheathing the chains of the Marion sword. Was surprised and asked if that sword, it was really grenade. Told him that he had officially gone crazy, had always known that he was a troublemaker, but not to that point. Later it will be. Turned to the Count Hunter, calling him by his first name, rounding, and asked him if he still maintained his claim that Christian had changed for the better. Redoon confirmed it, but Marion defied his belief, pointing out that this was Christian himself, who now intended to use a sword, sacred in a duel. Morocco has Marion, if he was not allowed to use a sword, sacred, and declared that the only thing that mattered was victory. No matter what method or trick is necessary. Marion Law reported that even the head of the clan, Old Man, had failed to master grinning, and warned him that the power, sacred of the sword, would reduce him to ashes. He simply asked if that was the case and removed the sword sheath. Marion shouted that it was dangerous, but he successfully wielded the sword in front of them, leaving her speechless. Then Marion asked him if it was a replica. He threw grenade to her and asked if she wanted to check it out for herself. She caught the sword, but immediately released a surge of electricity at the perception of its dark energy. Quickly left her, fall to the ground, and demanded to know how he was doing it. He picked up grenade, now completely inert in his hands, and told him it was a trade secret that it could not share. Hung grenade on his chest and told Marion that at least she could be sure of one thing. The only reason he could, wielding the sword, that even the clan chief, Old Man, had not been able to dominate, it was because he was a genius. The Count was surprised, but the words moved him deeply. Suddenly a loud laugh resounded through the training camps. A voice said it was always so entertaining, attracting everyone's attention. Turned to see Milan coming out through the portal. Ilane couldn't believe there was tamed a sacred sword, but then dismissed it and won. Why it mattered. With a threatening appearance, declared that today would be his last day in that Melon world. Then he pounced towards him and wielded his sword against him. Fortunately, he blocked her with granite as expected by the power and the speed of Melons were now similar to those of yesteryear. Without any smile, she was overwhelming. She threw herself at him again, and he realized that he could not close that. Unknown at all, blocked the sword of Milo again and grenade released an explosion of light magic to deflect dark magic infused in his sword. Something that both Reborn and Marion noticed. Marion turned around and asked him if he was right in thinking that at that level, Chris had already surpassed him when he was younger. Reborn thought that this was not the end as long as watched Chris fighting to block relentless Melon attacks. Reborn beat Marion. If it could see how it moved Chris to wield the sacred sword, observe how the light that emanated from grenades weakened every time his dark magic exploded. Even so, Melon clearly struggling to block his blows, which now contained both light and radiation energy. Reborn commented that the power was incredible, but Chris' dark energy seemed unstable. Mario disagreed, explaining that Chris was controlling deliberately its dark energy at every moment to prevent the sacred sword from rejecting him. He managed to drive Melon away and asked him how he was doing and if he liked the battle. She ignored the question and admitted that she had been thinking something for a while. Asked him if he had been predicting his movements. He quietly thought it was working. He quite observant. Explained that each sword technique had a previous movement. She had to raise her arms before lowering her sword, which implied specific movements of their shoulders and part of upper body, was something that both as the experts had in common. She sighed, releasing a wave of dark energy, and asked him what he thought about it. Then enveloped the dark energy around it and in it. Mockingly reminded him that the boys in the black swamp were magic swords. Unfortunately for her, an explosion of sacred magic exploded from inside and purified the dark energy that surrounded him. He sighed, relieved, knowing that this could have been a serious problem. She asked him if it was a purification artifact, but he ignored her question and thanked her sweetly round, saying that he only survived thanks to him, even though Round had no idea A had taken it, knowing that he should have been insured in the secret fall he admitted with, who was sometimes prone to robbery, playing Reborn, incredulous that he was proud of such behavior. Then pulled something out of her coat, explaining that in the royal battles, having a good team was a skill in itself. Threw the object on Melon, which surprised her. Exploded, releasing a burst of dark energy. She managed to narrowly dodge it, but he immediately launched another projectile and told him that it was not worth trying to dodge, as the second explosion erupted into powerful flames, surprising him with his strength. Was happy to have taken money from a great tell to purchase such artifacts, as they were proving to be very effective. Shouted at him in a manner mocking that she knew she was still alive, and told her to come out. Already suddenly a great wild sword shot from the flames. Heading directly towards him, he lifted up quietly the pomegranate and blocked the sheet. Incoming, the sword cracked and broke into pieces. Reborn proudly commented that he had been wondering why Chris had thrown that ball of air corrosion, and reminded Marion of who had said that Chris was a genius. Marion remained calm, but agreed with him. Mila emerged from the flames furiously and walked towards him. She smiled with malice and rushed forward at high speed, shouting that it was too much fun and asking, "What would be your next move?" Marion and Reborn panicked when they realized that Melon had lost its mind, but he quietly walked away and blocked his fist, deflecting him with a strong slap in the face. Melon was stunned to see that he had deflected his attack so easily. Immediately closed the distance between them and swung grenade towards his neck, told him it seemed to be his victory, and asked him if it had been enough. Message to her. Melon, with a scratch on his face, was shocked. Reborn was filled with pride for his son's performance, while Marion was incredulous. Then Melon burst out laughing and asked him if he was serious. I was asking him that question when he couldn't even calm down. He told her to give your response to your previous application as soon as possible. Although the victory was his, said he would respect his decision if he refused, since loyalty was not something that could be forced. She asked him if he would continue fighting her in this way in the future. If he decided to be on his side, he helped her up and thought he would, no matter what she wanted. A moment later, Marion was in a guest room at the hunting estate. I still can't believe how Chris was handling dark energy that way. recalled the old clan leader's refusal to dominate Grenadier, and asked him if it had also been impossible for him. The leader of the old clan, I thought that although I could handle it momentarily, as I knew, waves of dark energy were always changing. To handle Grenadier, one would need constantly adapt to these waves on something the sword could not detect, and wondered who could do that in a real combat. Then speculated that perhaps just a demon or the dragon, demonic they could make it, or else they could. Perhaps a despicable madman who could control dark energy as naturally as breathing Marion. Then remembered Craze, proudly asking how it had done so, and whether it had been enough to earn his praise. Smiled at the memory of his confident smile, and wondered if perhaps his father's wish, so long kept, could finally be fulfilled the following day. In the kitchen of Hunting Paradise, saw a chief orc cutting something very carefully. But it turned out to be just a little strawberry the orc then gently placed the strawberry on a freshly made cake. He was visibly upset, unable to believe that the orc I would have been the one making strawberry cakes. Mary laughed and told him that despite the boss's confirmation, his skills were top-notch. The boss then replied that he was bringing him to the kitchen. He thought he was there to make some cookies. Mary asked him why he was making cookies, and he explained that he wanted to give them to someone. His eyes were filled with tears as he approached and asked if it was a woman, that it was not her. He shouted that it was not what he thought, although technically it was for a woman. Mary, still puking, helped him put on an apron. While he rolled up the sleeves of his shirt, the boss offered to bake the cookies for him, but he declined, saying what to do snacks with the heart with their own hands was what really mattered. Proudly told them that even if it did not seem so, cookies were his specialty. Just at that moment, a red look quieted his face. Turning in horror, saw two other orcs, bosses crushing strawberries so violently that it looked like a massacre, shouting at them if they were sure that they had not added real blood to strawberry chewies. Mary just laughed in response. A moment later, ran to Marion, who was getting ready to leave. She asked him what was going on, and he told her that he had heard that he was leaving and had come to say goodbye. She smiled and said she appreciated it, adding that he must have been tired from yesterday's duel. He thought he was not. Then gave him a small box. When he opened it, found cookies inside. Clarifying her appearance, she told him shrilly that he really shouldn't have prepared a gift. I thought I was just happy to see her again and couldn't help but do something wrong. Then recalled that Chris had asked him if there was any particular food that Marion, and realized that this should have been the reason why Chris had been looking for it the day before. Thought to himself that Chris really knew how to win over people. Chris urged Marion to try it, proudly saying that he had baked them. She asked if that was really true, and he confirmed it. She took a cookie and tasted it, quickly realizing that he was playing. But it was recomposed, and calmly told him that it was very tasty. He thought he was happy that he liked Mario. Then told him that he should give him something in exchange for such a good gift, and asked him if there was anything he wanted, smiling. He told her that he wished that from now on, she would become his real aunt. She was surprised and said that, since they were already related by blood, there had to be a deeper meaning behind his words. Asked him if it was true that he was participating in the sacred, dark rite such as Rum had mentioned. He nodded in response. She thought A should be waiting to gain their support in the next succession conflict. However, he explained that the adults of the family must remain impartial to the candidates. That was the rule. He clarified that he was simply making a sincere request, that he just wanted to get closer to her. She moves it absurd and asked him if he really had no hidden motive. He assured her that he did not, and that if she decided offer him their support secretly out of affection, he would reject it. Then gave him a long, puppy-eyed look. Laughing, she told him that she did not dislike her sincerity, given that his had baked such delicious cookies and had given them to him as a gift. Could not help but appreciate it. He warmly thanked her. Marion then asked if I could have more cookies. Tasty next time. He thought I would depend on her. She asked him what he meant by that. He told her if she made him feel sad, could become moody and unable to recreate the taste. Then made two hearts with his fingers and asked if he understood. She sighed and getting serious. Asked him what he thought about joining the boys. Black Shadow was about to respond when she interrupted him, saying that he had been exceptional in the duel against Milan and could even be a prodigy, older than the leader of the old clan. However, their opponents would not be easy opponents, and she had to be able to, with or before his talent, had the opportunity to flourish. He confidently thought that if he did not succeed, overcome the mountains ahead, he wouldn't mind dying. He appreciated his concern. But I didn't think I would lose. She found his confidence irrational, but for some reason he smiled, thinking that if it was Chris maybe it would be possible. She agreed and said that she did not. I would stop walking down a road, bloody because after all he was a demon. But asked for advice. Jumping on his horse with the box of cookies in his hand, warned him to be careful with the first young round. I understand why they should be careful with Julian and not with So, since Julian was the gentlest of the 5 young gentlemen. Marion just thought they would soon understand. Therese thanked him for the advice and promised to take it into account. She turned her horse and told him she would see him next time. A moment later, he lay down on his bed lost in his thoughts. Both his father and his aunt had reached the 6-star level. However, he had not heard much about his roles in the Great War. That made him wonder how many powerful fighters existed in the Empire. Assumed that it would probably had enough to overwhelm the domain of light at least. Even so, he did not want his past to repeat itself and remembered himself. Ain needed become stronger and faster. 1 month later, entered the office and asked him if he had called him. Redunan thought there was something important. I needed to tell you, but when I looked and saw it, was surprised to discover that Chris had already reached the rank of 2 stars. Redoon. I could hardly believe that Chris would have achieved such growth in just 1 month, but Chris simply shrugged and reminded him that he had promised. So you should not be surprised. Then asked him what he wanted to talk about, especially at that time, and Redoon replied that he had received news from the family. Principal Redoon explained that he had run for Chris Yator as candidates for the Sacred Dark Rite, but only Tor had been approved. The reason said was Chris' frivolous spending. His behavior womanizes alcoholism, destruction of property, and even theft, all of which is. Unfortunately, it was true. Chris felt every word like a knock and fell to the ground, dramatically, by the truth of his own actions. But he was furious. He shouted, demanding to know how they dared to belittle their son. Then replied to Redoon if the Mink of Lang had been the one behind the decision. But Round denied with his head, added that the real problem was far away, something Chris had already been waiting for. Loin was a direct descendant of the main family, and the leading candidate in the next Dark Sacred Rite. The rite itself was a ritual in which the candidates were absorbed pure oxygen of the negative dimension. Given that the number of requests was limited, candidates were forced to participate in a kind of combat, deadly to establish a hierarchy. Those who occupied the highest positions absorbed more oxygen, gaining an advantage. Criticism in the selection of the next young gentleman, the successor of the Chris clan. I knew that if I dominated the ritual and the darkness, his dream of becoming the 6th young gentleman would be much more difficult to achieve. Round reassured by telling him not to worry, promising to talk to the main family again, and if it was necessary, ask Mario for help. But Chris turned down the offer, saying that it was not necessary and that he would solve it on his own. Reedon put a hand on his son's chest, telling him that he recognized his talent and that he had in fact changed, but that this was an issue that adults could handle. Chris smiled softly at her father's words, and I thought I appreciated the feeling, but who had his own methods. When he saw that smile, he showed his piquesse. I was sure Chris was already up to something. The only thing he could do was to ask if Chris already had any ideas. Chris replied to Redoon if any child in the house of the Hinditanmen would participate among the refugee families. Redoon confirmed that Timon's 3rd son would be there. Immediately enraged, Redoon shouted that the Count Timon was a rascal who had allied himself with Loni, who was not entitled to participate in the rite. Sacred Dar unburdened himself, saying that they cheat was simply a cheater who only knew how to control demonic beasts. Chris, surprised by the unusual outburst of Redoon, realized how protective his father could be. Calmly told Redoon to calm down, and explained that he simply needed prove yourself. I already knew that the family pulse would be organizing a black pill house soon and planned to participate as a caregiver. Me interest Tanto in the chest of the Marion clan chief. Informed the clan chief that he had checked Christian personally how he had been ordered to. The clan chief asked how the boy was doing, and she too, what a Chris was now useless to others. Even so, the clan chief found it difficult for him to believe that the child I remember had been a brat who thought he was a genius. when in reality he was nothing more than a false prodigy. Marion assured him that Chris was now clearly different. The clan chief asked if she believed he could fulfill the long-desired wish, the same reason why the clan chief had continued to live even using magic that defied heaven to delay death. Marion hesitated, knowing that his father's wish was the only thing that kept him alive at last. I thought I couldn't say for sure, but what a Chris could be the closest to achieving it. This intrigued the clan chief, who decided I should keep an eye on the boy, then asked if it was true that Chris would participate in the next rite. Sacred Dark. Marion confirmed that yes, which was the general consensus within the clan. When he asked if he would intervene, the clan chief denied with his head and said he could not act on such a delicate matter. How he could call himself a fierce beast? I thought I couldn't even pass such a small test. Surprised by her Marion words, reminded him that even though Chris could be a ferocious beast, I was still a child. She thought Chris at least should have the opportunity to receive friendship and awaken its potential. But the clan chief simply looked at her with disdain. Immediately silencing it, she looked away, trying to say nothing more. Marion. I knew that the clan chief had always been like that, harder on those for whom he had high expectations. Then the clan chief told him that, since she was willing to go so far, it must have been that he really liked Chris. Then summoned a demon, sucks blood, and a man instantly appeared before him. Simon, the main butler of the dark magic clan. Simon bowed and asked if the clan chief had called him the head of the clan, asking if Simon had heard what he had said to himself, to which Simon replied in the affirmative. But I thought if I should just watch that little despicable Christian. The clan chief confirmed and ordered Simon. That will inform everything that Chris did until the dark sacred rite. Simon nodded and said he understood and would carry out the order. Then Simon asked if I could make a little joke during monitoring. What surprised Mario. The clan chief gave him a withering look, but finally accepted, warning me not to go overboard. Simon smiled enthusiastically and left immediately to fulfill its mission. Marion closed his eyes and silently waited for Chris to come out of all this. Well, mientras tanto, during the trip, Chris was sitting inside the cart, deep in their thoughts. I knew I had achieved 2-star status quickly thanks to his talent. However, despite all his training, terror and dark energy reserves were still insufficient. I knew that reaching 3 stars at that time, it was impossible. Realized that he needed a black pill to accumulate rapidly dark energy in a short period of time. Wondered whether the black pill organized by the family, Drani, a coincidence or simply a to provoke it. Either way, considered the problem a luck. Yet it was to capture the demonic beast. Parag did not automatically guarantee a black pill. Would have to comply with special conditions. The cart stopped in front of Grantel, who greeted him with an expression I thought I had brought them there. Chris took it by chance, how he had been and if he had arrived empty-handed. Grantel was surprised by the question, but quickly, I guess not that I would never agree him without a gift. Chris. Unimpressed, he hit the money bag, dropping it on the ground with force. Grantel looked at him confused and surprised. Chris then asked him why he brought such a pathetic gift, and told him that he clearly did not understand his furious place. Luz accused Grantel of engaging in illegal activities, and asked him whether tax evasion in the casinos was proving profitable for you. Also demanded that he know how he was doing with the objects granted by the had swindled from the Merchants Guild, and whether he continued to people. Won and defeated. Grantel shouted desperately, asking what he wanted. Chris told him that he would let him pass this time, but warned him to cease all activities that crossed the line. Grantel felt it in agreement. Then Chris told Grantel that he needed something, a Grantel ash pill. Trembled when he learned that the ash tablets had gone up, recently priced on the black market. Chris stroked him on the head and told him he understood the situation, then turned to Mary, who was behind him, and asked him if he was ready. Mary, laughing, transformed into his demonic form, revealing too sharp, and declared that his torture skills were excellent. Grantel screamed in fear, dropped immediately, knees, and shouted that he would get the ash pill. Chris immediately smiled and asked him if things were going well. Were not much easier when large Falco operated later, winked and added that while Grantel was on it, I should also get him a dagger, sharp enough to cut armor. Perhaps Grantel totally confused. Backing towards the car, Chris said goodbye to Grantel as Grantel moved away. hit his forehead against the ground and cursed him out loud. Merry if they were on their way home, but Chris had no other place to go. Soon stopped in front of a Chris potion store. Ordered him to the driver to stop, and then entered the store with. Mary looked around, scanned the shelves and pointed out one in particular. The owner of the store took out the article and placed it on the table. Mary looked at the potion and asked what it was for. Chris calmly replied that he had a use for her. Mary looked at him with distrust, what made Chris sweat nervously. She squinted and seriously asked if it could be to redeem him. He nodded and explained that considering his father's age, needed make sure to take care of it. The owner of the store showed himself, visibly surprised. Chris then turned to him and shouted that for the honor of Camp, should keep it a secret. The nervous owner: I thought I would be very careful. The next day, Turt and Ridin went out to say goodbye to him to Lo Fratello, but he immediately reminded her of its proper title. Trembling Tur was corrected and called Honorable King, Emperor Majesty Brother. Then calmed down and said he had heard that the House of the Black Pill was dangerous and asked him to be careful not to turn out to be dangerous. Mockingly wounded, Chris asked him if Tur cared about him. Blushing, explained that he was only concerned that they did not have a proper round. Duel interrupted, telling them to stop fighting as siblings and instructed Chris to make sure to crush their nose to those despicable angels of Pole. Chris confidently replied that he would and promised, back with good news. Then Ridun turned to Tur and asked him what the title of King Emperor meant. What surprised a Tur, who quickly thought that Ridun did not need to know. Later in the Count's house, Temin the butler informed them again that they were not allowed to enter the Count's mansion. His furious servants demanded to know how the butler dared to say such a thing after making them wait all that time, and if I even knew who they were. The impassive butler explained that it was a water table order and clearly said that Alaguas had no favor to return to a despicable gentleman. Chris looked at the butler with fury, and I understand if he really dared to suggest that he had to find his own lodging. What made the butler shudder? However, he confirmed that this was the case. One of Chris's servants, angry, asked permission to eliminate the butler on the spot, but Chris stopped him and spoke calmly to him. And what about the payment for alternative accommodation on? Butler stuttered and thought they could send the bill to the Count. Timon. Chris, smiling, agreed to find his own accommodation. A little later, reached a large mansion with a central fountain and gilded exterior details. Was a huge and luxurious hotel. One of the servants asked how much the place would cost, and another that would cost at least 100,000 rupees. Chris simply said it was not common that they could spend someone else's money so freely, and told them that they had an hour to arrange their lunch. After that, would go out to drink. Suddenly one of this moved. He was turned to her when he heard a sound coming from within. Gave a blue glow. Mary suddenly came out of the radiant with emotion. Exclaimed enthusiastically that the mansion in front of them was impressive and perfect to serve him in surprise. He demanded to know why she was there. He explained that he had hidden himself inside his cell because she had promised to be his maid forever. He simply sighed, speechless by her unexpected appearance. Mary laughed, telling him that the way he was behaving, shy and embarrassed, was simply adorable, and that his expression clearly showed how much I missed her. He was about to deny it with disdain, when suddenly someone shouted at him rudely. It was Alois, the third son of Count Timon, who shouted at him demanding an explanation for the exorbitant bill. Chris thought Alois would begin to speak informally immediately. He asked him if this was not the protagonist of the house. Black Pig then reminded him of Alois, who had been the one who told him to find your own place to stay, and that's why he did it. Added that his honorable guest could not stay in a simple hotel, so he decided to buy an acceptable mansion instead. Then with a smile, the writings if Alois was really making a fuss over such small amount of money. Chris continued, saying that considering how pathetic Alois was, someone who didn't even know how to treat a guest adequately, the amount was actually a cheap price for a valuable lesson of furious manners. Alois wrinkled the shield in his hand, and at his dark power, summoning his pet beast within his voice, asked Chris if he really wanted to die. Chris used the technique immediately. Was the art of subjugation of Count Timon, a method of forbidden dark magic, distinct from the subjugation arts of beasts of the Alliance, manipulated demonic beasts through fear. injecting secret formulas that caused hallucinations, paranoia, and unnatural excitement yet seemed more complex than expected, and Chris realized that it would be difficult to master the technique in a short time, so instead considered whether he should simply beat the beast into disarray. Addressing Mary, asked him if he was right in thinking that taking the terrifying pet would require a gun. Laughing, Mary took out a simple piece of wood and gave it to him as his weapon. He smiled, and in a mocking tone asked Alois what he was doing. Wasn't I going to attack him like a real demon? Alois yelled at him not to give him orders, calling it despicable, and then ordered his pet to attack the beast. Jumped towards Chris with his mouth wide open. Chris blocked it with the wooden stick, but the sharp teeth of the beast broke the wood and threw it back with force. He rolled on the ground, rose quickly, and said that the mascot was not bad at all, but literally if 2-on-1 wasn't a bit unfair. Then upped the ante if Alois won, would have to participate in the house as a guard instead of just being a shepherd. After all, had to be at least something dramatic to make it. Chris was Alois, a cheat demon, and you told him what you did with the deal. Furious, Alois jumped behind his path and carried forward with his beast, swearing to make Chris kneel. Alois ordered the creature to lift its claw and stamps it against the ground. The impact destroyed the terrain, but when the dust cleared, Chris was gone. Alois in confusion, asking where I had gone, not knowing that Chris was now behind him. With a dramatic movement, Chris hit with the wooden stick the back of the head of them. Alois then hit him repeatedly before landing on the ground, rolling the stick playfully in his hand. Asked Alois if it hurt, but warned him not to cry, because I would not treat it more gently, just for a few hearts. Alois screamed in anger and ran towards Chris again, but before I could hit him, a grimace appeared behind him, scaring his pet. That stopped it, terrified, and ran to hide behind the mirror. Lee now demanded to know how Chris dared to scare his pet. So Chris casually explained that he had used a simple 2-star illusion spell, and apparently that was just too much, so that the pathetic Alois subjugation arts will handle it. Alois yelled at him to shut up and began to cast another spell when Chris noticed that Alois was summoning his horse demon. This time he screamed and asked if he knew what was the trait of a blood grade. Alois grunted and replied that Chris did not come out with words, but threw the wooden stick, hitting Alois directly on the forehead. Alois fell to the ground unconscious. Chris looked at it from above and commented that he would not expect a transformation and not a spell to be cast. That was their real trait, of level fooled. The invocation of Alois vanished halfway through and disappeared. Then he was betting when his servant called him, concerned if I was sure I could do so. To which he replied that there was a long time, so I should rest while I could. However, his servant informed him that in fact, I was not resting at the time, to which the prota, annoyed, asked him what was wrong with that a good-for-nothing person does good-for-nothing things, and I understand Mary. Yes, he was right. Mary, laughing, agreed with him, and assured the servants that everything was fine, as long as Chris did not drink alcohol, then gave him juice ale, which frustrated him when he saw it because he wanted alcohol, and I was sad of not being able to take any. While the butler of Alois remained vigilant from the side, wondering why Alois wanted me to keep watch, as such despicable. Then he spoke to Alois' butlers, if they wanted to join them at the table, and told them that he was sure that his master would not wake up until the next day, for he had beaten it to pieces. Then they winked and assured them that he would keep it a secret if they joined, what angered the butlers even more. Replied that they did not have to join him, and that he had to take care of his own business. He playfully agreed and told them to have fun, watching it hours later. When the sun was about to set, he shouted to their servants to deal the cards and drink their share of alcohol. His servant thought it wouldn't go easy on him this time. More hours passed, and the dark sky appeared on the Alois butlers were upset watching him and his servants sleep on the table of exhaustion and drunkenness, which made them think it made no sense to continue watching longer, and that they should make a brief report. Then woke up when he heard the butlers leaving of the room, immediately sat down and looked out the window to see if the servants were already gone. I was upset because it had become late, and knew it had to get going. Then gave his coat to Mary and pulled her outer coat out of her purse, telling him I needed to go somewhere quickly. So I was not supposed to follow him. A moment later, on Kitten Mountain, looked around and was to see the secret land of Count Timon's house. Noticed that the energy of the demon beasts was very dense, there as suggested by his grandfather. Then walked quietly, knowing that he would soon be arriving at home. As expected, he saw the home ground, but was surprised that there were only 2 guards. Then slowly became invisible and was pleased to have discovered the invisibility spell of Mary recalled when he asked Mary to teach him, then easily walked among the guards without their noticing and entered the home grounds. Minutes later, saw a scenario and ran towards him, wondering if it was the altar where they would celebrate the final of the black pill, because it was as creepy as they said. Then recalled that his friend had told him in the past that he had to make an offer of give him his life to obtain a black pill. In other words, it should make him so terrified that he would rather die. Suamigo added that just as the opposites are connected, the fear, intense, and radiant joy are in the same spectrum, so that in that brief moment, the classic ash pill is reborn like the black pill. That's why Count Timon's house specializes in mastering demonic beasts through fear. Is the one leading the black pill. Smiled at the memory and understood that, as Lena mentioned, planned to steal the final technique of the time and let the fuck to get out of control after giving the mix to aphrodisiac with various substances and monopolize the black pill for himself. But I knew there was no time enough to steal his technique and learn it, so I needed to find another way. Suddenly felt a strong energy came out behind him, what made him turn, wondering if anyone was there. Then heard something at close range and got up, turned toward the noise and ran toward it at full speed. Saw a nearby cave and was surprised to see it, then carefully entered, but immediately smelled an intense malice and noticed the presence of a dark magic barrier inside. Wondered if it was a hay crack. The world of demons, Chris. I couldn't believe there was a crack that would connect it to the human world right there. Then had an idea and wondered if I should get the fuck over there, since he had aphrodisiac to tempt him. Strongly held the potion and was moved by the house cave rescue without noticing a red bat in the center of the cave. Observing it, the bat spread its wings and Simon returned to his form. Human did not expect the little despicable was so interesting. Simon saw that he not only humiliated the scammed brat, but also made its observers let their guard down, acting as a hero and secretly entering prohibited areas, clearly something. Simon was excited because Chris made him want to play a joke on her. Even more terrible, Simon approached the crack and stuck his hand in it. What made him believe? Simon's blood fell on the barrier, leaving on the ground, which dissolved in smoke, and a voice like Simon and asked him what his wish was, while Simon smiled maliciously excitedly. The next morning Alois proudly nailed the flagpole on the ground and raised her up with his servants and Chris. But then Chris in a mocking tone replied to Alois, if I thought it looked great for someone who had been defeated by him. What made Alois disappointed him to shut up and call him an opponent. Alois then asked him why he had brought a grenade, and if I couldn't even use it, and he thought it was more effective than a club. Then asked if Alois wanted to try it. Making Alois tremble with fear, Alois then called the shepherds and ordered them to lure the fuck out to the altar, to which they responded, yes. Later, Alois commanded the demons assigned to the guard to continue because they would be standing by the altar, and also replied that yes. Chris then noticed the red bat hanging in the tree above them. But before I could react, Lee shouted at her to respond, and he mockingly admitted that yes. Then came to that, and the guard told him to turn away because he would be in the way of the house. He thought it was good for him if he stayed there, but warned the guard that I did not come to cry to him for cleaning help when everything goes wrong, which made the guard furious and called him a fool. But then Alois stopped the guard and told him not to run out before he started the house. Alois then recognized him and ordered him to stop to take care of the flag, to which he replied mockingly that yes, saying that the governor would faithfully protect the flag. Then lay down against a tree while guarding the flag and decided to observe how they were trying to give their best. I was sure that I was only fell into their trap and had made sure to carry the dagger and the ash pill that the poor big guy had given to him. Suddenly they heard something huge approaching, and he knew that it, like a four-legged demonic beast with magic, was being to the altar. But then he looked at her with tears, which made her wonder why she looked so dumb. The guard then asked Alois if he was ready, and told him to begin the art of submission. Alois walked forward in response and activated the magic circle of his art of submission. Then began his spell on the courage, while the shepherds kept it in its place. But the fuck smelled the aphrodisiac potion on the ground and was instantly affected by it, lost control. Surprising and Aloys. But before I could react, the fucker pushed him. The guard immediately ran towards Aloys to ask him if it was right. While the Kurahov was stuffing it, it released garbage into the air, and the shepherds rushed to form a defense. Chris saw them protect Aloys with all his strength, while the Kurahov tried to break his defense and knew it would not work, because the Kurahov was out of control due to aphrodisiac Aloy. I knew that they had consumed some antidote in advance, but it would still be dangerous if it were prolonged. The servants immediately covered their noses and mouths to avoid inhale the poison, and tried with all their might to stop the fuck. But he was too strong and threw them aside with ease. The fuck then bowed his head and lowered it towards Aloys, but fortunately for him, someone translates block her in time, and Aloys was surprised to see that she was Pris, who was struggling to survive the fuck out of the pomegranate. Pris told Aloys that the house of the Count Temin was quite pathetic, forcing the flag bearer to intervene. Then mockingly told Aloys that I would be kind and rescue him if he promised call him little brother. Aloys called him crazy and asked him why he would do that, but Chris simply asked him back, asking him what he managed to do, and reminding him that they did not have all the time in the world. Aloys looked at his servants, struggling to breathe due to the iron, and gritted his teeth while then furiously leaving Chris a despicable, but asked for his help. Chris accepted, but reminded Aloys to keep his promise. Then he pushed hard the fucking head to one side using the grenade and began to cast the spell of the art of submission. Chains came out of their magic and became enveloped around the head and the body of the fuck. Aloys was surprised to see him using the art of submission, but Chris simply called it a peasant for being surprised, and I understand if I thought only they could use it, knowing that as long as it wasn't a secret technique, something like art submission intermediate was no big deal. Then pulled the chain strongly to one side and the firmly held jumped behind the Karahot as he pulled the chain over his head, upwards by rotating it to one side. Then checked it to run in that direction, making Aloy scream in a panic, telling him that he stopped as they were heading towards the crack, but Chris simply smiled sufficiently at Lay and moved on. Only minutes later, arrived at the cave with the fuck and pulled the chain to stop the fuck. Then he saw the dark magic barrier around the cave and screamed in fear, but Chris calmly asked him if it was the first time he had seen the malice of Dina, and in a mocking manner, told him to be terrified by the pain and fear overwhelming the fuck. Stopped painting and his eyes turned into a black pill. Chris immediately took out the dagger from behind his back and stabbed the fucking eye, then began to cut off his head to remove the eye. A moment later Aloys and the others came to the cave and asked him, worried Chris if he was okay. Aloys then told him it was a cave, extremely dangerous, and that they needed to get out quickly. But Chris just told him not to be such a coward and asked him what they should do, then showed them the pill and told them that it turned out to be an ash pill, not a black pill. What surprised everyone, Aloy bit his lip with frustration, and his servant spoke to Hato what they were going to do with it, shouting that if Aloy had not intervened, that would not have happened. But Aloys ordered them to leave him, and Lee thanked Chris for rescuing his subordinates, admitting that they managed to finish without major injuries thanks to him. This surprised Chris, because he did not expect it from Aloys. Then it felt a little bad, and then it felt even worse when he learned that he had changed the black pill, but he remembered himself that I had to do what I had to do. Then told him in tone of mockery to Aloys, who will call him brother, because he had promised. What left Aloys in shock? Chris asked him if he was breaking his word, and Aloys I guess he never made such a promise, and that she was 2 years older than him. Suddenly the cave trembled and did a strong force that surprised everyone. The servants fell to the ground, because they could not withstand the pressure, but Alicia and Chris stood up. Lee asked what was going on, but Chris kept silent and looked back. Then he saw a huge demon with blue eyes, brilliant at them, which terrified him. The demon told them that it had been a while since he had seen a boy, and Chris knew immediately that he was a demon from. Then Aloy stood in front of him, stuttering, telling him to run away now, that he was an outsider and had to be saved. Nevertheless, Chris remained silent and noticed the same bat from before to one side, turned the tip of the daggerio in his hand and threw it in the direction of the bat, hit him successfully, but turned to ashes and returned to Simon, who was in shock while watching from the portal. Simon moves when Chris had it, noticed, and thought he could stop the demon after observing a little. But now that the bat clone he had planned to use for teleportation had left, it would take at least 5 minutes to get there, even if he used blood magic to its limits. Simon knew that if I arrived too late, everyone would die then. He immediately rushed into the cave at full speed. In the cave, the demon told Chris that he was interesting and asked him what he was up to. Chris just smiled. And I thought he didn't like it when someone tried to spy on him. What made the demon laugh and say that it certainly had many worries for did Chris look the four-armed demon, and he deduced that compared to the demons he had confronted during the era of destruction, this was of low rank, yet was at least a 5-star demon, not someone I could face head-on at that moment. However, he lifted a finger and spread drowsy smoke, causing Aloy's guards to fall instantly. In a deep sleep, Aloy shouted, asking what he was doing and why I was putting them to sleep when they needed fight together, and sighed with frustration at the realization that Aloy's had a strong resistance to magic. Then punched him in the shoulder as I told him to stop talking and go to sleep. Aloy's collapsed to the ground unconscious. The devil was confused by his actions and asked if he intended to offer others as sacrifices. The devil then accepted, forgive Chris life, and even bless him in exchange for humans, but Chris simply told him that he was talking too much and then covered a grenade, pointing it at the demon, while claimed that it was his principle not to associate with his type of. The demon carried the grenade and aimed his hand towards Chris, gathering power, told him that the idea was commendable, but a sacred sword that he could not use. It was just a piece of scrap metal. The demon then the magical power towards him. Chris blocked him with the grenade, but the force was too strong and was thrown against the wall. The demon him and said he would give him a chance, or offer them and he will forgive his insignificant lie. Chris simply spit in the demon's face, which infuriated him even more. Then came out in a mocking tone, who had said he could not use the sacred sword, swayed the grenade toward the demon's hand, freeing himself, dropped through the air and rolled on landing. Then released its magic of light, the sacred power of the grenade. The devil was surprised by the see him and die like a demon, as he could use the power of light. But Chris simply asked him back if he finally felt that his life that was in danger, infuriated the demon even more, and put together their hands to gather power, leaning stronger, while shouting that I would slaughter him, then launched an even more powerful attack on Chris, but he calmly prepared and activated the light technique, Dead Sea Shear. A brilliant burst of light cut through the dark demon magic and shot himself towards it. The devil could not believe what he saw, while the light split it in half, killing him instantly. Chris, gasping, observed how his breath fogged up and he saw everything around him blurred, realizing that he had overstretched his body, then collapsed to the ground, slowly losing consciousness as it faded. Recalled events, surprised voice, asking if he had seen the light of the division of the Dead Sea and managed to replicate it literally, that it was something like that, and showed it to Ivan. Ivan denied with his head, incredulous, saying that Chris really was something. Then explained that the light of the division of the Dead Sea represented I love the flash of light that divides the Dead Sea, but ironically, even with that sword technique, Ivan had failed to become the light of the Mer clan. Then told Chris that he blindly would be the light that would save the world. A being Kentil touched Chris' head and thought it was interesting. Presented herself as a Manhwa, a first seat in the 7th kingdom of Kina. As the followers arrived, they threw to rescue them. Chris let her eyes close while Manhwa whispered that I was looking forward to their future actions. Days later at Count Taman's mansion, he was in his room feeling pain in his head, and I couldn't believe I had been lying there for 2 full days. Checked his body and noticed that he was fine, then recalled the black pill and was glad to see that it was still there. Immediately the bag from his nightstand in sight, relieved to see the black pill inside. Then recalled Nafenet and thought he had received some attention. Unwanted. I knew that occasionally the demons that stand out early receive the blessing of a demon and can be grown quickly. But he wondered why he should care if that was something they received. The bad guys. Then he thought an evil world demon would not even be the high